There is a sound my phone still makes that I have never been able to change. 3 short rings, then silence, then a small vibration against the wood of a table, like something knocking once and giving up. I know exactly how long those 3 rings last. I have counted them more times than I would ever admit to anyone. That sound is the whole reason I am telling you this. My name is Adrienne Cole. I am 44 years old, and for the last 16 years I have lived in Portland, Oregon, in a house with a porch light that I still turn on every night out of habit, though there is no one left to come home to it. I design buildings for a living, mostly office interiors, the kind of work that fills a person's calendar without ever quite filling their life. I should tell you that up front, because it matters later. I was a man who was very good at being busy, and for a long time I mistook that for being good at everything else. I should start with how it began, because the order of things matters here, more than I understood at the time. If I tell it out of order, it will sound like a tragedy that arrived out of nowhere. It didn't. It arrived the way most tragedies do, slowly, in small missed moments, until one particular moment turned out to be the one that couldn't be taken back. I met Lena in a conference room, of all places, on the 9th floor of a building I had helped design 3 years earlier. She worked in finance for the firm 1 floor above mine, and she had come down to sit in on a presentation about lighting fixtures, of all the unglamorous things. She asked one question, a real question, not a polite one, about whether the fixtures we'd chosen would actually hold up under the kind of long hours people in that building tended to work. I remember thinking that she was the only person in the room who understood that a building isn't really about the walls. It's about the people who get tired inside it. We were married 2 years later, in a small ceremony that her mother thought was too small and my father thought was too loud. Lena had a laugh that came out sideways, like it surprised her every time. She kept a running list on the refrigerator of restaurants we said we'd try and never did. She called me every evening at 6:15, without fail, for 11 years. Not 6, not 6:30. 6:15. It was the time she finished walking our dog, Milo, around the block near her office, and the time, she said, when she needed to hear a voice that wasn't asking her for something. I want you to hold on to that number. 6:15. It will come back. Before I go further, I should tell you a little more about who we were, because I don't want you picturing 2 strangers who happen to share a mortgage. Lena grew up in a small town outside Salem, the daughter of a schoolteacher and a man who repaired boats for a living, and she used to say that growing up around boats teaches you something about patience, that you can't rush a hull that isn't ready to hold water. She brought that patience into everything. She was the kind of person who read the last page of a book only after finishing it properly, who never once, in 11 years, raised her voice at me, not because she didn't feel anger but because she believed yelling was a kind of giving up on being understood. I was not always easy to be married to, and I think it's important that I say that plainly, instead of letting you imagine some blameless woman married to a man who simply worked too hard. I was proud, in the quiet way architects are trained to be proud, convinced that the buildings I made would outlast me and therefore mattered more than most ordinary hours. Lena used to tease me, gently, that I loved buildings because they couldn't ask me for anything I hadn't already agreed to give. I laughed when she said it. I didn't understand, not really, how much truth was folded into that joke. Our first years together were, by any honest measure, good ones. We bought the townhouse on a street lined with maples that turned an almost embarrassing shade of orange every October, and Lena filled it slowly with things that made it feel less like 2 people's furniture pushed together and more like a life. A chipped blue teapot from her grandmother, a row of cookbooks she rarely followed exactly, a bench by the front window where Milo, still a puppy then, learned to wait for the mail carrier. In the evenings, before the calls became a habit instead of a hunger, we used to sit on that bench together and watch the street go dark, and she would ask me questions about my day that were really questions about me, not the drawings, not the deadlines, but whether I was tired, whether I was proud of anything, whether I was happy. I answered those questions honestly for longer than I'm comfortable admitting I stopped. In the early years, I answered every single one of those calls. I remember that clearly, because I remember what it felt like to hear my phone ring at that hour and feel something in my chest unclench, the way a held breath lets go. She would tell me about her day in this unhurried way, like she had all the time in the world, even when she didn't. I would tell her what I was working on, and she would ask questions about ceiling heights and materials that she had no professional reason to care about, just because she wanted to know what filled my hours. Somewhere in the 5th or 6th year, the calls started arriving during meetings more often than not. I don't think there was a single day I decided to change. It was smaller than that, a client who insisted on late afternoon calls, a project that kept slipping, a habit of silencing my phone the moment I walked into any room with more than 2 people in it. I told myself I would call her back the second I stepped out. Most days, I did. Some days, I forgot until 8 or 9, and she would say, lightly, I was starting to think you'd been kidnapped, and I would laugh and apologize and mean it, and do the same thing again in a week. There was a night, maybe 2 years before everything I'm about to tell you, when Lena said something I brushed past without really hearing it. We were washing dishes, and she said, sometimes I feel like I'm competing with buildings that don't exist yet. I told her that was ridiculous, that she was being dramatic, and she let it go with a small shrug that I understand now took more effort than I gave her credit for. I think about that shrug more than almost anything else. It was the sound of someone deciding not to ask twice. Her sister, Priya, noticed before I did, or at least she said something before I did. At a family dinner that spring, she pulled me aside while Lena was in the kitchen and said, she's not complaining, but I want you to know she's not complaining a lot lately. That's different. I told Priya I'd been slammed at work, that things would settle down after the Ashford project wrapped. Priya looked at me for a second longer than felt comfortable and said, things always settle down after the next project, Adrian. I laughed it off. I want to tell you I took it seriously. I didn't, not the way I should have. There was a smaller moment, too, one I didn't understand the size of until much later. We had a standing dinner reservation, the second Friday of every month, at a small Italian place 2 blocks from our house, the kind of restaurant where the owner remembered your name and your usual order without needing to ask. It was Lena's one insistence in an otherwise flexible marriage. Everything else can move, she used to say, but not this. I missed it twice that year for work calls that, in hindsight, could have waited until Monday. The second time, she went alone, and when I got home she was sitting at the kitchen table with a small paper bag of leftovers, and she didn't say anything about it at all. She just handed me the bag and asked if I'd eaten. I remember being relieved that she wasn't upset. I understand now that her not saying anything was not the same as her not minding. I also remember, more than once, catching her on the phone with Priya in a lowered voice, laughing at something, and going quiet the moment I walked into the room, not out of guilt, I don't think, but because some part of that conversation belonged to her alone, a place she had built for herself precisely because the place I was supposed to occupy kept being crowded out by other things. I didn't ask what they talked about. I told myself it wasn't my business. I wonder now if I simply didn't want to know the answer. The Ashford project did not settle down. It grew. By that autumn I was leading the design team for a building that would take up most evenings and half my weekends for almost a year. Lena adjusted, the way people who love you quietly adjust, without making it a referendum on the marriage. She started calling a little less at 6:15 and a little more not at all, on days when she assumed I'd be unreachable. I told myself that was normal. I told myself a lot of things were normal that year. Looking back, I can see now that this was the season when the shape of our marriage changed without either of us naming it. We still ate dinner together most nights, still slept in the same bed, still laughed at the same things when we found the time to laugh. But there was a distance creeping into the ordinary hours, the kind that doesn't announce itself as a crisis, because nothing about it looks like a crisis from the inside. Lena started walking Milo a little longer than she needed to, I think now, just to have somewhere to be that wasn't an empty house waiting on a man who might or might not come home for dinner. I started staying an extra hour at the office some evenings, not because the work demanded it, but because the office had become a place where I was needed in a way I understood, and home had quietly become a place where I wasn't sure how to be needed at all. I remember one Sunday that October, a rare day when I wasn't working, when Lena asked if we could actually talk, about the pace things had taken. We sat on the bench by the front window, the one Milo used to wait at for the mail, and she said, carefully, "I'm not asking you to quit your job, Adrian. I'm asking you to notice when you're not here, even when you're standing right next to me." I told her I understood, and I meant it in the moment, the way you mean most promises you make on a quiet Sunday with no meetings scheduled. I did notice, for a while. 2 weeks, maybe 3. Then the Ashford deadline moved up, and I stopped noticing again, and she stopped asking, and I mistook her silence for the problem being solved instead of what it actually was, which was her deciding it wasn't worth the fight it would take to keep asking. Here is the night I need to tell you about carefully, because I have replayed it so many times that I sometimes worry I've smoothed it into a story instead of a memory. It was a Thursday in October. I was in a conference room on the 12th floor with 4 other people from my firm and 2 from Ashford's leadership team, going over elevation drawings that were already a week behind schedule. My phone was face down on the table, silenced, the way it always was in that room. At 6:15, it buzzed once against the wood. I glanced at it without picking it up. Lena's name, and a small photo of her laughing on a beach in Cannon Beach 2 summers before. I remember thinking, she'll understand, I'll call her the second this wraps. At 6:19, it buzzed again. Same name. At 6:22, again. 3 times in 7 minutes was not something Lena did. Lena, who left long, patient voicemails about restaurant reservations and Milo's vet appointments, did not call 3 times in a row unless something was wrong. I felt something small and cold move through me, the kind of feeling you get right before you understand you've made a mistake, but I was mid-sentence, explaining a load-bearing wall change to a man named Frank Ashford who was already unhappy with our timeline, and some old, practiced part of my mind decided that whatever this was could hold for 11 more minutes. It could not hold. I did not know that yet. I finished the meeting at 6:41. I remember the exact minute because I looked at my phone the second Frank Ashford stood up to shake my hand, and I saw a 4th missed call, and beneath it, a voicemail. 91 seconds long. I remember staring at that number, 91 seconds, while riding down in the elevator, telling myself I would listen to it in the car. I did not listen to it in the car. I called her back instead, standing in the parking garage, and she did not answer. I told myself she was probably in the shower, or walking Milo without her phone, and I got in my car and drove home the way I drove home every night, along the same 4 turns I could have made with my eyes closed. There was an ambulance outside our house when I turned onto our street. I'm not going to describe everything about that night in detail, because some of it isn't mine to give you, and some of it I still can't say out loud without losing the thread of my own voice. What I can tell you is this: Lena had collapsed in our kitchen a little after 6 that evening, a sudden and violent reaction to something no one, including her doctors, had seen coming. She had called me at 6:15 because she felt something was wrong and didn't want to worry me by saying so directly. She called again at 6:19 because it was getting worse. She called a 3rd time at 6:22, and that was the last time she was able to hold the phone herself. A neighbor, Mrs. Okafor, heard something through the shared wall of our townhouse and found her on the kitchen floor a few minutes after that, already unconscious, and called for help. I was not there. I was 11 minutes and 3 ignored calls away, discussing load-bearing walls with a man whose name I have not been able to hear since without my stomach turning. She was gone before I reached the hospital. The doctors told me, gently, in the careful language people use for exactly this kind of gentleness, that even if I had answered on the first ring, even if I had been standing beside her at 6:15 exactly, there was a real chance nothing could have changed the outcome. I have turned that sentence over 10,000 times in the years since, trying to decide whether it was meant as comfort or as truth, and I have never fully decided. I think, most nights, it can be both and still not be enough. For a long time after the funeral, I did not touch her phone. It sat in a drawer in our bedroom, my bedroom, I suppose, now, charged, dark, untouched, for almost 4 months. Priya asked me once if I wanted her to go through it, to close accounts, to do the practical things that death requires of the people left behind, and I told her I would do it myself. I never did. I think some part of me understood that opening that phone would be the last conversation I ever had with my wife, and I was not ready to let it end. Those 4 months were the strangest of my life, in ways I don't think I can fully explain even now. The house kept its shape without her in it, which felt like a kind of betrayal all its own. The refrigerator list of restaurants we never tried was still there when I finally worked up the nerve to look at it, her handwriting slanting the way it always did, one line reading simply the ramen place, finally, as though we'd had all the time in the world to get to it. I couldn't bring myself to erase it. It's still there. People were kind to me in that stretch, in the specific, careful way people are kind to a man who has lost his wife suddenly and young. Colleagues sent flowers I didn't know what to do with. Frank Ashford, of all people, sent a handwritten note that said only, "I'm sorry. Take whatever time you need. The building can wait." I remember reading that note and feeling something close to rage, not at him, but at the fact that the building had, in fact, waited, that it would always have waited, if I had only asked it to, on the one night it actually mattered. I went back to work too early, the way I think a lot of people do, because an empty desk felt somehow less unbearable than an empty house. I moved through client meetings and elevation drawings with a kind of hollow competence, the muscle memory of a profession doing the work my heart no longer had any interest in. At home, I avoided the bedroom drawer where Lena's phone sat charging, the way you avoid a bruise you know will still be tender if you press it. I told myself I would deal with it eventually. Eventually, for a long time, meant never. It was Milo, in the end, who made me pick it up. He was old by then, arthritic, sleeping most of the day, and one February evening he stood at the bedroom door and would not stop whining at that drawer, the way dogs sometimes do at things they don't have words for. I sat down on the floor beside him and opened it, and I turned the phone on, and I let it sit in my palm buzzing back to life with 4 months of unanswered notifications. I want to tell you what I found there, because it is the reason I am telling you any of this at all. Among the voicemails, unplayed, dated the week before she died, there was one from her cardiologist's office. I hadn't known she had a cardiologist. She had gone in twice that autumn, quietly, without telling me, for what she described in her own calendar notes as just some tightness, probably nothing. The voicemail confirmed a follow-up appointment she never made it to. I sat with that for a long time, understanding for the first time that she had likely known something was wrong in her body for weeks, and had chosen, in her particular way, not to make it my burden until she was more certain. I found other things in that phone, too, smaller things that took on a different weight once I understood what came after them. There was a note, dated the same week, titled simply "Talk to Adrian about slowing down, not a fight, just a conversation." She had never had that conversation. I don't know if she ran out of time or ran out of nerve, and I have never been able to decide which of those two possibilities I find harder to sit with. There was a folder of photos she'd been quietly collecting for months, the maples on our street in every season, Milo asleep in patches of afternoon light, the chipped blue teapot on the windowsill, the kind of photos you take not because anything is happening, but because you want proof, later, that a particular ordinary life existed and mattered. I hadn't known she was building that folder. I like to think she was building it for herself. Some nights I let myself believe she was building it, in some small way, for me. I also found a string of text messages to Priya from that final autumn, most of them light, a few of them not. In one, sent on a Tuesday in September, she'd written, "I think he'd notice if the house burned down. I'm less sure he'd notice if I did." Priya had responded with a laughing emoji, the kind you send when you think a friend is being wry rather than honest, and Lena had replied, yeah, probably being dramatic, which was the exact phrase she used again, weeks later, in the voicemail I am about to tell you about. I understand now that this was a kind of pattern with her, noticing something true and then talking herself out of the weight of it, so as not to become, in her own eyes, someone who complained. But it was the voicemail from that final night, the 91-second one I never listened to in the car, that undid me completely. Her voice was steady at first, careful, the way she got when she was trying not to alarm anyone. "Hey, it's me," she said. "I don't want you to worry, but something feels off, and I think I should probably go get checked out, and I don't really want to drive myself feeling like this. Call me back when you get a second." There was a pause, maybe 4 seconds of just her breathing, and then, quieter, almost to herself, "I'm probably being dramatic." "You'd tell me I'm being dramatic." Another pause, longer this time. And then, right before the message cut off, "I love the life we built, Adrian. Even the parts where you're not really here. I just wanted you to know that, in case I never say it right." I have listened to that voicemail more times than I will admit to you here. I no longer listen to it to punish myself, though for the first year, that is exactly what it was for. I listen to it now because it is the last full sentence of my wife's voice that I have, and because somewhere inside those 91 seconds is the truest thing anyone has ever said to me, delivered at the one moment I was not there to receive it. The reckoning, if you can call it that, didn't happen all at once. It happened in pieces, over the better part of a year. It happened the day I finally called Priya and told her about the voicemail. She was quiet for a long moment on the other end of the line, and I could hear her breathing catch the way it does right before someone decides to be honest with you instead of kind to you. "I heard part of that call," she admitted finally. "Not the whole thing." She told me a version of it, after, when she thought it was just going to be a scare and a funny story later. I asked her what Lena had said. Priya hesitated, then told me, "She said you'd feel terrible if you knew you'd missed it, and she made me promise not to make a big deal out of it when you called her back. She was already planning how to make you feel okay about it, Adrian. Before she even knew how bad it was." I sat with that for a long time after we hung up. It was, in its own way, the most Lena thing I had ever heard, worrying about my guilt before her own emergency had even finished happening. It happened the day I finally drove past the Ashford building, finished now, glass and steel exactly as I'd designed it, its lobby lit up the way I'd once imagined would make me proud beyond measure. I parked across the street and sat there for almost 20 minutes, waiting to feel something like triumph, and felt instead a strange, hollow indifference toward the thing I had once let eclipse an evening that mattered more than any building ever could. I have not gone back since. It happened the day I sat in Mrs. Okafor's kitchen, the woman who had found Lena, and thanked her properly for the first time. She made tea I didn't really want and let me sit in her small, warm kitchen for almost 2 hours, and at some point she took my hand and said, "She talked about you like you hung the moon, you know." Even that night, before it got bad, she was smiling when she said your name. She told me, "He's probably still in that meeting, isn't he?" And she laughed about it, like it was just a thing you did, like it was almost funny to her, how predictable you were. I didn't know whether to feel comforted or destroyed by that. I think, in the end, it was both, arriving at once, the way most true things about grief tend to. It happened, too, more quietly, on ordinary evenings I didn't expect to matter. I started going to a support group that met on Tuesdays in the basement of a church not far from our house, full of people who understood, without needing it explained, what it means to carry a specific unanswerable minute for the rest of your life. A man there named Walter, who had lost his own wife 2 years before I lost mine, told me once, "The guilt doesn't go away. It just stops being the only thing in the room." I didn't believe him the first time he said it. I believe him now, most days. I did not tell Mrs. Okafor about the missed calls. I have never told most people the exact shape of that Thursday. I am telling you, now, because I think there is a version of this story that people need more than they need another tidy tragedy with no lesson in it. I still work in the same field. I design fewer things now, and more carefully, and I have never again let a phone sit face down and silent in a room while someone I loved was trying to reach me. That is not superstition. It's a promise I made to a version of myself who would give almost anything to have those 11 minutes back. I changed something else, too, though it took me longer to understand why I needed to. I started answering my mother's calls on the first ring instead of the third. I started sitting with Priya on Sunday afternoons, not because either of us has much new to say, but because showing up has become, for me, its own kind of language, the one I wish I had spoken more fluently while I still had the chance. I finished the folder Lena had started, in a way. I go back to the Maples every October now and take one photograph, the same angle she used to use, and I keep them in a drawer beside the phone I finally learned to open. I don't know what I'm keeping them for. I think I'm keeping them the way she was, as proof that this ordinary, imperfect life mattered, even in the parts one got wrong. Milo is gone now too, 2 winters after Lena, and I buried his collar in the garden bed she used to keep, beneath the hydrangeas she never got to see bloom that final spring. I still turn the porch light on every night. I still keep 6:15 open on my calendar every single evening, permanently blocked, for no one and nothing, a kind of standing appointment with a call I will never get to take again, kept anyway, because keeping it is the only way I know how to answer her now. Sometimes, on the nights the house feels too quiet, I take her phone out of the drawer, it doesn't hold a charge for long anymore, and I've had to replace the battery twice just to keep it alive, and I listen to that 91-second voicemail one more time. I used to listen for the parts that hurt. Now I mostly listen for the part where she says my name like it still means something worth trusting. It does. It always did. I only wish I had let myself hear it while she was still here to say it twice. I don't know that there's a clean lesson in any of this. I've heard people say that grief teaches you to be present, and maybe that's true, though it feels too small a word for what it actually costs to learn it. What I know is that love rarely announces itself as urgent. It rings quietly, 3 times, and waits to see if you'll notice. I didn't, once, when it mattered more than anything I have ever done or built or finished on time. I don't say that to be forgiven. I say it because somewhere, tonight, someone's phone is buzzing on a table while they finish one more thing first, certain there will always be a later. I think, in the end, what I most want you to take from this isn't the guilt, though I understand if that's the part that stays with you longest. It stayed with me longest, too, for years. What I actually want you to take is smaller and, I think, more useful. It's this: the people who love us rarely ask loudly for the thing they need most. They ask quietly, in 6:15 phone calls and lowered voices on the phone with a sister, in shrugs they hope you'll notice and folders of photographs they never mention out loud. The asking is easy to miss precisely because it isn't designed to interrupt you. It's designed to be answered by someone who was already paying attention. I was not always that someone. I am trying to be now, every ordinary evening, in the small unremarkable minutes that I once assumed I could always make up for later. I no longer believe that. I know now, in the most permanent way a person, there isn't always a later. I would give anything to be wrong about that. I'm not. If this story stayed with you, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more quiet, honest stories.